The hum of the industrial refrigerator provided a steady baseline to the muffled sounds of the string quartet drifting through the double doors. I sat on an overturned plastic milk crate in the loading dock of the Waverley Botanical Conservatory, wiping a smudge of reduced balsamic from the sleeve of my chef's coat. The coastal evening air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and salt, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the prep kitchen behind me. My name was Morgan. I was 42 years old, the owner of a specialized mobile catering company that was currently teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and I had just been physically blocked from entering the main dining hall of a reception I had fully funded. A shadow fell over the concrete ramp. Isaac, my lead prep cook, stood holding a clipboard against his apron. He looked out toward the manicured lawns, where 200 guests were sipping champagne, then down at me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew better. Instead, he tapped the clipboard. We had a problem, and it was entirely separate from the fact that my aunt had just assigned me a folding chair next to the dishwashing station. To understand why I was sitting in the alley of a luxury venue I had paid $45,000 to secure, you have to understand the leverage Sutton held over my life. Sutton was my mother's sister. When my mother passed away 3 years ago, she left behind a substantial trust intended to help me expand my business and cover the medical debts my daughter had accrued during a long battle with a respiratory illness. But my mother, always anxious about my unconventional career path, had named Sutton as the trustee. The stipulations were vague, granting Sutton the power to release the funds when she deemed me financially stable and socially responsible. For 3 years, Sutton moved the goalposts. First, I needed to pay off a specific loan. Then I needed to secure a brick-and-mortar location. Finally, when a warehouse fire wiped out half my equipment and pushed me to the brink, she offered a deal. Her daughter Chloe was getting married. Sutton demanded an extravagant affair at the Waverley Conservatory. She promised that if I covered the venue rental and catered the event at my own expense, proving my professional capacity on a grand scale, she would sign the authorization to dissolve the trust and transfer the assets to me. I had drafted a contract. She signed it. I liquidated my remaining personal savings, took out a predatory short-term loan, and paid the conservatory. I designed a menu featuring hand-dived scallops, dry-aged beef, and a complex dessert bar. I thought I was buying my freedom. Instead, I had walked into a trap. The first sign of trouble had occurred during the cocktail hour. I had changed out of my prep clothes into a formal dress, intending to join the reception as a guest and a family member. But when I approached the ballroom doors, the hired event coordinator, a woman Sutton had brought in from out of state, handed me a headset and told me my designated seat was in the staff break room. When I tried to find my place card at the family table, it was gone. Sutton had intercepted me near the ice sculpture, smiling thinly as she adjusted her diamond earrings. She whispered that a vendor mingling with the guests would ruin the aesthetic of the evening, and that if I made a scene, she would consider it a breach of our agreement regarding my professional conduct. I had retreated to the loading dock to calm down and review my options. That was when Isaac found me. He squatted down, pointing a latex-gloved finger at the digital temperature log on his clipboard. The main walk-in cooler, the one holding all the raw seafood for the first course, had spiked to 62 degrees. It had been sitting at that temperature for nearly 2 hours. I stood up, the exhaustion instantly replaced by cold adrenaline. The Waverley Conservatory was a historic property, and their kitchen equipment was heavily monitored. If the food was compromised, it wasn't just a ruined dinner. It was a massive health code violation. My catering license would be suspended pending an investigation. If I lost my license, my business would officially fold. And if my business folded, Sutton would have the perfect legal justification to declare me financially unstable and withhold the trust indefinitely. I marched past Isaac, through the heavy metal doors, and into the prep kitchen. The heat of the ovens hit me like a physical wall. I went straight to the primary walk-in cooler. The digital display on the outside blinked a warning in red. I checked the heavy metal latch. It was securely closed. I pulled it open. The blast of air that hit my face was barely cooler than room temperature. I dropped to my knees and inspected the lower intake vent. The heavy-duty power cable, A thick black cord that locked into a specialized industrial outlet in the wall had been twisted and violently yanked loose. It wasn't an accidental bump. The safety latch on the outlet was snapped. Someone had deliberately disabled the unit. Isaac crouched beside me. He confirmed that all the staff had been working the past appetizers on the terrace for the last 2 hours. The kitchen had been completely empty. I needed to find Yelena. She was the estate manager for the Waverley Conservatory, a woman known for running the historic property with iron-fisted precision. We had clashed earlier in the day over the placement of my service tables, and she was not my biggest fan, but she was fanatical about the integrity of the venue. I found Yelena in the main corridor, adjusting the lighting on a portrait of the estate's founder. When I told her the cooler had been tampered with, her expression tightened into a mask of pure bureaucratic fury. She didn't immediately believe me. She accused my staff of negligence, warning me that the venue's insurance would hold me liable for any spoiled goods and the subsequent refund the family would undoubtedly demand. I asked her to look at the outlet. I needed her to see the broken safety latch. She followed me into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She inspected the damage, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she pulled a walkie-talkie from her belt and called the front gate. She asked if anyone from the state health department had arrived. My stomach dropped. I asked her why she was checking on the health department. Yelena looked at me, her eyes narrowing. She explained that Sutton had called her 30 minutes ago, claiming that several guests who had eaten the past appetizers were complaining of severe nausea. Sutton had demanded that Yelena contact an emergency health inspector to evaluate the kitchen, citing fears of mass food poisoning. The trap was closing. Sutton wasn't just going to ruin the dinner. She was orchestrating a documented intervention by state authorities to completely destroy my professional record. I took a slow breath, forcing my panic down. I looked at the ceiling. The conservatory had always maintained strict aesthetic standards, hiding their modern infrastructure behind antique facades. But I remembered an email Yelena had sent out to all approved vendors 3 weeks ago. It was a notification about an updated insurance protocol. I asked Yelena about the environmental monitoring sensors. The email had mentioned new ceiling-mounted units designed to detect fire, smoke, and unauthorized access to restricted zones. Yelena hesitated. The sensors were a point of contention with the estate's board, as they were expensive and invasive. She admitted they were active. They didn't just record environmental data. They captured high-resolution thermal imaging and time-stamped access logs to protect the venue against liability claims from catering companies exactly like mine. I told her I needed to see the data for the kitchen from the last 2 hours. I told her that if she allowed the health inspector to shut me down without reviewing the logs, I would file a countersuit against the conservatory for failing to secure their own equipment, making her personally responsible for the breach. It was a gamble. Yelena cared about her job more than she cared about my family drama. She motioned for me and Isaac to follow her. We bypassed the ballroom and went down a narrow set of carpeted stairs to the administrative basement. Yelena's office was a windowless room lined with filing cabinets and a large bank of monitors. Just as we entered, her radio crackled. The health inspector had arrived. Yelena instructed security to escort him directly to her office. The inspector, a tired-looking man carrying a silver briefcase, walked in a few minutes later. He was clearly annoyed at being called out on a weekend evening. He started to explain the protocol for confiscating contaminated food, but Yelena held up a hand. She turned to her computer terminal and pulled up the security interface. The monitors flickered to life. The camera angle covered the entire prep kitchen. Yelena entered the time code for 2 hours prior. The screen showed the kitchen emptying out as my staff took the appetizers to the terrace. For several minutes the room was still. Then the heavy swinging doors pushed open. Sutton walked in. She was wearing her emerald green mother of the bride dress. She looked around, ensuring the room was empty. She didn't look up at the ceiling. She didn't know the new sensors were there. We watched in absolute silence as my aunt walked over to the primary cooler. She tried to pull the plug, but the safety latch held. She braced her foot against the wall, grabbed the thick black cord with both hands, and jerked it downward with her entire body weight. The latch snapped. The cord fell to the floor. Sutton smoothed her dress, checked her reflection in the stainless steel door and walked out. The health inspector let out a low whistle. He closed his silver briefcase. Yelena leaned back in her chair. The tension in the room had completely shifted. The issue was no longer a caterer's negligence. It was deliberate sabotage of venue property by the client. I asked Yelena what the venue's policy was for a client who intentionally damages equipment and creates a hazardous environment. Yelena's voice was icy. She stated that it was a total violation of the venue contract. The client becomes instantly liable for all damages, all vendor costs, and immediate eviction from the property. I turned to the inspector. I told him the raw seafood was ruined and I would not serve it. But the rest of the menu, the items stored in the secondary units, were safe. He nodded, but added that due to the deliberate tampering, he had to embargo the kitchen as a crime scene until the police documented the vandalism. No food could be served. At all. I thanked him. Yelena, the inspector, and I walked upstairs. The jazz band had stopped playing. The guests were seated in the grand ballroom, waiting for the first course. Sutton was at the head table, holding a microphone, preparing to give a speech. She saw me walk in through the side doors with Yelena and the inspector, and a look of triumphant anticipation crossed her face. She thought the inspector was there to drag me out in handcuffs. Yelena walked straight to the head table. She didn't ask for a private conversation. She didn't care about the 200 guests. She cared about the integrity of the Waverley Conservatory. Yelena informed Sutton in a clear, carrying voice that the catering service was permanently suspended for the evening. Sutton put the microphone down, feigning shock. She loudly proclaimed that it was a tragedy, but that she had suspected my business practices were unsafe, which was why she had called the authorities. She looked around the room, playing the victim, gathering the sympathy of the guests. Yelena didn't flinch. She handed Sutton a tablet. On the screen, paused perfectly on the moment Sutton kicked the wall to snap the outlet, was the thermal imaging footage. Yelena stated, loud enough for the first 3 rows of tables to hear, that the police were en route to document the property damage Sutton had caused. She added that Sutton's contract with the venue was voided due to malicious sabotage, and she was now personally liable for the $50,000 penalty clause, plus the cost of the ruined food. Sutton stared at the tablet. Her jaw moved, but no sound came out. She looked at me, then at the inspector, then at the faces of her friends and colleagues sitting at the nearby tables who had heard every word Yelena said. The blood drained from her face. She tried to stammer out a defense, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that she was just checking the equipment, but the image on the screen was undeniable. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an apology. I simply stepped forward and pulled a folded document from my apron pocket. It was the contract we had signed, the one stating I would cater the event in exchange for the release of my mother's trust. I told Sutton that I had fulfilled my end of the agreement by providing the food and the venue, and that her deliberate destruction of the inventory constituted a criminal attempt to defraud me of my inheritance. I informed her that the police report Yelena was filing would be attached to an emergency injunction my lawyer would submit on Monday morning to have her permanently removed as trustee. I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked back toward the kitchen doors. The ballroom behind me was quiet, save for the murmurs of confusion and shock rippling through the guests as the reality of the situation set in. 200 people were stranded at a remote estate with no food, and the mother of the bride was about to be interviewed by local law enforcement. I walked through the prep area, gathered my knives, and packed them into my leather roll. Isaac was waiting by the back exit. He had salvaged 2 portions of the dry-aged beef that had been resting on the counter, perfectly safe from the cooler incident. He had seared them over a portable butane burner. We walked out to the loading dock. The evening air felt cleaner now. We sat on the plastic milk crates, eating the prime cuts of meat off paper plates, listening to the distant sound of police sirens approaching the main gates. I looked at the legal document in my hand, knowing the fight in the courts would take months, but also knowing that the leverage Sutton had held over my life was finally broken. I took a bite of the steak, tasting the rosemary and the clarified butter, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt completely in control of my own kitchen. The siren song of the Waverley Conservatory disaster did not end when the police cruisers pulled away from the service gates. If anything, the real noise was just beginning. Monday morning arrived with the oppressive weight of a coastal fog, matching the atmosphere in the austere, glass-panelled conference room of my attorney, David. I had brought the printed thermal stills, the police report number, and the original catering contract. I expected a swift legal decapitation. I expected David to file the injunction, remove Sutton as the trustee, and finally release my mother's funds so I could pay my daughter's mounting pulmonary specialist bills and salvage my business. David, however, was a realist. He steepled his fingers, staring at the thermal image of my aunt ripping a heavy electrical cable from a wall. He explained that while the Waverley incident proved property damage and breach of contract with the venue, proving fiduciary malice regarding the trust was a different legal battlefield entirely. Sutton was already moving. Before we even drafted our injunction, David received a thick courier package from a high-powered corporate litigation firm in the city. Sutton was not retreating, she was doubling down. Her lawyers had filed a preemptive motion, claiming I was financially insolvent and emotionally unstable. Their narrative was dangerously clever. They argued that I had orchestrated the entire Waverley disaster because my catering business was secretly bankrupt, and I could not afford to serve the food I had promised. They claimed Sutton was merely inspecting the equipment because she suspected my fraud, and the outlet broke accidentally during her inspection. As a protective measure, Sutton had frozen every single asset in my mother's trust, explicitly cutting off the monthly medical stipend that had kept my daughter's treatments funded. The cruelty of it took my breath away. She was using my child's lungs as a bargaining chip to force me to drop the venue damages and the injunction. The fallout hit my business almost immediately. The elite social circles of our coastal town were small, and rumors spread faster than grease fires. Clients started calling to cancel their summer galas, citing vague concerns about my reliability and the alleged health department investigation. I spent the next 3 weeks operating out of a secondary, much smaller commissary kitchen, watching my calendar empty out while Isaac and my remaining skeleton crew scrubbed down equipment we had no reason to use. The $45,000 I had sunk into Chloe's wedding was gone. The predatory loan I took out to cover it was accumulating daily interest, and the trust was locked behind a wall of expensive billable hours. I needed a different angle. The video proved Sutton was a vandal, but I needed to prove she was a thief. If she was willing to destroy my inventory to maintain control of the trust, what was she actually protecting? I directed David to file a formal demand for a comprehensive forensic audit of the trust's ledger for the last 3 years. Sutton's legal team fought the discovery request tooth and nail, citing privacy concerns and administrative burdens, which only confirmed my suspicions. They managed to stall for a month, bleeding my remaining cash reserves dry with legal maneuvers. I was days away from missing rent on my own apartment, and the hospital billing department was leaving daily voicemails. The break came not from a courtroom, but from an unexpected source. The hired event coordinator from the wedding, a woman named Beatrice, whom Sutton had flown in from Chicago, reached out to me. Beatrice had caught the brunt of the Waverley Conservatory's wrath. Yelena had formally blacklisted Beatrice's agency from ever operating at the historic estate again. Furious and seeking to clear her own professional name, Beatrice asked to meet me at a neutral location, a rundown diner 2 towns over. Beatrice slid a thick manila folder across the sticky table. She explained that Sutton had refused to pay the final installment of her coordination fee, blaming her for failing to manage the catering vendors. In retaliation, Beatrice had brought the receipts. She opened the folder, revealing the internal accounting ledger for Chloe's wedding. I scanned the documents. I saw the massive invoices for the floral arrangements, the string quartet, the designer dress, and Beatrice's own exorbitant retainer, but it was not the sheer amounts that made my blood run cold. It was the routing numbers at the bottom of the wire transfer confirmations. I recognized the last 4 digits of the originating account. It was not Sutton's personal checking account. It was the routing number for my mother's trust. Sutton had not just forced me to pay for the venue and the catering out of my own pocket. She had used the trust, my inheritance, and my daughter's medical safety net to finance the rest of her daughter's luxury wedding. She had quietly siphoned over $120,000 in a matter of months, categorizing them as miscellaneous legal and administrative trust expenses. I thanked Beatrice, took the folder, and drove straight to David's office. We finally had the smoking gun. This was undisputed, documented embezzlement. David immediately drafted an emergency motion, bypassing the standard hearing schedule to present the wire transfers and the vendor invoices directly to a probate judge. The judge granted the motion the next morning, issuing an immediate freeze on Sutton's personal accounts and temporarily suspending her trustee powers pending a full criminal investigation. For 24 hours, I felt a profound, exhausting relief. I thought the war was finally over, and the siege on my family was lifted. But the next afternoon, David called me. His voice lacked the triumphant tone I had expected. He told me to sit down. The court-appointed forensic accountant had finally gained access to the trust's master ledger to trace the wedding funds and authorize the immediate release of my daughter's medical stipend. The accountant had found the wedding withdrawals, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. The trust was originally supposed to hold nearly $2 million in diversified assets and liquid capital. David paused, the silence on the phone stretching out until it felt like a physical weight in my chest. He told me the trust was empty. The accounts had been systematically drained over the last 3 years, transferred out in thousands of small, untraceable increments into a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. Sutton had not just delayed giving me the money. She had stolen almost all of it, and the frozen accounts the judge had just seized contained nothing but dust. The silence in my kitchen was absolute when David hung up the phone. For 3 years I had endured Sutton's condescension, her arbitrary rules, and her endless delays because I believed there was a safety net waiting at the end of the ordeal. Learning that the trust was empty felt less like a betrayal and more like a physical collapse. The money meant to secure my daughter's breathing treatments, the capital meant to replace my burned catering equipment, the inheritance my mother had painstakingly built. It was all phantom numbers on a screen, dispersed into offshore accounts that would take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to trace. I sat at my small dining table in the dark, listening to the shallow, uneven rhythm of my daughter sleeping in the next room, and realized Sutton had not just beaten me. She had destroyed us. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of numb automation. I drafted an email to the hospital billing department begging for a payment plan I knew I couldn't honor. I looked at the liquidation value of my remaining commercial ovens. I was preparing for complete surrender. But on Wednesday morning, David called me back, and the exhaustion in his voice had been replaced by a sharp, clinical edge. He told me to come to his office immediately. When I arrived, the conference table was covered in the invoices and wire transfer receipts Beatrice had given me at the diner. David was standing by the window, holding a red marker. He explained that people who steal $2 million usually possess the sophistication to hide it completely, but arrogance makes people sloppy. Sutton had successfully funneled the vast majority of the trust into untraceable Caribbean holding companies. However, when it came time to pay for Chloe's wedding, Sutton had grown complacent. She didn't want to go through the complex process of repatriating the stolen money and triggering a tax audit. Instead, she had simply wired the remaining $120,000 directly from the domestic trust account to the wedding vendors in Chicago and New York. David tapped the receipts. He explained that stealing money from a family trust was a civil matter, a slow and agonizing probate dispute that Sutton could easily afford to drag out until I went bankrupt. But crossing state lines to wire stolen funds to corporate vendors was wire fraud. It was a federal crime. And thanks to Beatrice's meticulous record-keeping, we had the exact routing numbers, timestamps and IP addresses Sutton had used to execute the transfers from her home computer. We did not go back to the probate judge. David bypassed the local courts entirely and handed the file to an contact at the United States Attorney's Office. The shift in power was not televised. It did not happen at a family gathering or a dramatic trial. It happened in the form of a federal subpoena delivered to Sutton's front door at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. The sudden involvement of federal prosecutors froze whatever remaining liquidity Sutton had hidden domestically. Her high-powered corporate lawyers realizing they had been paid with potentially stolen funds and were now sitting in the middle of a federal wire fraud investigation, immediately withdrew as her counsel. Within 2 weeks, Sutton was cornered. The federal prosecutors offered her a stark choice: face a multi-count indictment for wire fraud and tax evasion, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence, or agree to a global restitution settlement that would make the trust completely whole before the end of the fiscal quarter. To avoid federal prison, Sutton had to produce $2 million in cash immediately. Since the offshore money was locked behind layers of shell companies that she could no longer access without triggering international money laundering flags, she was forced to liquidate her actual life. The climax of the 3-year nightmare took place in a windowless mediation room on the 14th floor of a federal building. There were no guests, no catered food, and no dramatic speeches. Sutton sat across from me, flanked by a frantic mid-level public defender she had been forced to hire. She wore a simple beige sweater, her usual pristine blowout looking flat and unkempt. She didn't look at me. She spent the entire hour staring at the grain of the wooden table. Without a word, Sutton signed the documents David slid across the table. She signed over the deed to her sprawling coastal estate. She signed away her husband's luxury vehicle collection. She liquidated her personal retirement accounts. Every signature was a forced dismantling of the social empire she had used to humiliate me. By the time she put the pen down, her hand was trembling violently. She tried to say something, a justification, a plea, an apology, but her voice cracked and she simply looked away, shrinking into her chair. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I only felt a profound, heavy relief that I would never have to speak to her again. The liquidation of Sutton's assets took 3 months. I used the first wave of recovered funds to pay off the predatory loan I had taken out for the Waverley Conservatory disaster. The second wave cleared my daughter's medical debt in its entirety, securing her treatments for the next 5 years. I didn't use the rest of the money to build a massive catering empire. The ordeal had cured me of the desire to chase the validation of high society clients who viewed service staff as invisible machinery. Instead, I bought a small, modest brick-and-mortar storefront on the edge of town. I stopped doing weddings. I transitioned the business into a specialized boutique bakery and neighborhood prep kitchen, serving people who actually looked me in the eye when they paid for their food. Isaac stayed on as my head chef, taking over the morning shift so I could be home when my daughter got out of school. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The coastal wind was rattling the glass of the storefront. The open sign was turned off. I stood in my own kitchen, surrounded by equipment I owned outright. I pulled a cast-iron skillet from the rack, turned on the burner, and watched the blue flame ignite. I placed a thick cut of dry-aged beef into the pan, listening to the immediate aggressive sizzle as the fat rendered. The exhaust hood hummed steadily above me. I reached for the rosemary and the clarified butter, moving with a quiet, practiced rhythm in a space that finally belonged entirely to me.
Here is a narrative text explaining the infographic The Caterer's Conflict, an analysis of family trauma, financial sabotage, and legal justice within the context of the story, meeting the requirement of 3,000 characters. The psychological and social dynamics of the ordeal Morgan endured at the hands of her aunt, Sutton, are deeply complex, a reality that the educational infographic powerfully illustrates by breaking down the narrative into 5 critical analytical pillars. The journey begins with what is described as the trap of financial control, a psychological warfare tactic that exploited not just Morgan's career ambitions but the absolute vulnerability of her personal life. Sutton leveraged her position as the trustee of Morgan's inheritance not for guidance but to exert total manipulative control, using vague stipulations regarding stability as a weapon against her. Socially, this represented a profound exploitation of familial trust, leaving Morgan teetering on the edge of professional and personal collapse while battling her daughter's mounting medical debt. The very invitation to cater the lavish Waverley Conservatory wedding was designed as a psychological snare, promising freedom while setting Morgan up for a public and professional failure that would legally validate Sutton's control. When the sabotage at Waverley occurred, it escalated beyond mere control into a calculated act of gaslighting, aimed directly at destroying Morgan's professional reputation. Sutton physical blocking Morgan from the dining hall was only the opening move. The deliberate disabling of the walk-in cooler, as visualized in the infographic's second section, was a form of systemic warfare. By attempting to trigger a health code violation, Sutton aimed to create a documented, state-level record of Morgan's supposed instability, a move that would have permanently suspended her license and dissolved her business. This action is a profound example of systemic exploitation, weaponizing the very regulatory systems that protect the public against the professional she sought to destroy, purely for personal, psychological domination. Uncovering the smoking guns marked the point where social capital and evidence gathering turned the tide from victimhood to agency. Morgan's power lay in her allies, Isaac's technical vigilance and Yelena's bureaucratic precision, both of whom allowed for the discovery and documentation of physical tampering. The arrival of Beatrice, the event coordinator, brought the missing piece of evidence, the financial records that proved social capital isn't just about friends, but about the reciprocity of professional respect in the face of exploitation. The thermal footage of the sabotage combined with Beatrice's ledger of embezzlement transitioned the case from a he-said-she-said family dispute to an unassailable dossier of documented proof. This powerful alignment of social networks and evidence is what enabled Morgan to move forward, transitioning from a reactive posture to strategic action. The subsequent federal intervention represented a profound shift in legal jurisdiction and consequences, illustrating the difference between fighting a civil probate delay and prosecuting a federal crime. By identifying Sutton's use of wire transfer for stolen funds across state lines to pay wedding vendors, Morgan and her attorney were able to target the action as wire fraud, a federal offense. This maneuver bypassed the standard, slow local courts that Sutton could easily maneuver, triggering a massive, inescapable accountability. The visual of high-power corporate lawyers withdrawing is critical. It demonstrates that once the illegality was clear, Sutton's social and financial armor was breached, leaving her isolated and forced to liquidate over $2 million in assets to avoid federal prison, a complete dissolution of the social empire she had spent a lifetime building. The conclusion, post-traumatic growth, focuses not on the financial triumph but on the profound psychological healing that occurs when validation is no longer sought from external, high-society sources. The infographic shows Morgan and her daughter in a simple, specialized local bakery, which represents the achievement of autonomous control. By investing the recovered funds into a modest business serving people who valued her food and respected her skill, Morgan chose a life focused on intrinsic peace and family, a powerful act of healing that proves true control of one's life and career is the ultimate justice. The quiet hum of her own kitchen, filled with equipment she owned outright, finally replaced the baseline of anxiety with a quiet, practiced rhythm that belonged entirely to her. This outcome demonstrates that the recovery was not just about regaining assets but about regaining the capacity for self-determination.